Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep, where we gently wander through the dusty corners of the past. Tonight, close your eyes as we slowly drift back to the medieval world. A time of the strange betrothal rituals in medieval times. The journey to marriage did not begin at the altar. It began much earlier, often years before the wedding, in the form of betrothal rituals. The betrothal, a formal promise to marry, was not a casual engagement but a binding contract, carrying almost the same weight as marriage itself. It was a public declaration, a social expectation, and, at times, a source of great tension and intrigue. To the medieval mind, a betrothal was sacred, and breaking it could bring shame, legal consequences, or even political conflict. Unlike today's romantic proposals, medieval betrothals were orchestrated by families with little consideration for the couple's personal feelings. Fathers negotiated with other fathers. Mothers discussed dowries and social status. The bride and groom, particularly among the noble class, were often absent from these negotiations, their futures traded. Like pieces in a grand game of political chess, some betrothals were arranged when the couple was still in the cradle. It was not unusual for children as young as 5, 7, or even infants to be promised to each other. These childhood betrothals were solemnized with contracts, sealed with rings, tokens, or written agreements. Families viewed these promises as unbreakable, even though the children involved had no say in the matter. Among the nobility, the stakes of betrothal were high. A betrothal could end wars, forge powerful alliances, and consolidate vast estates. It was the glue that held dynasties together. The breaking of a betrothal could spark feuds, damage reputations, and in some cases, reignite old conflicts. The ceremony of betrothal varied across regions and social classes, but certain elements were widely recognized. A priest often presided over the betrothal, blessing the union and ensuring it conformed to church law. Both families would gather, and the future bride and groom would exchange symbolic gifts. Sometimes these were simple rings or pieces of cloth, but other times they were more elaborate gold, animals, or even a small parcel of land. The exchange of tokens signified a binding promise. From that moment forward, the couple was considered pledged. In some cases, the betrothal was so binding that the relationship could only be dissolved under exceptional circumstances, such as the discovery of close kinship, consanguinity, that violated church regulations, or evidence of coercion. Interestingly, the betrothal often came with its own set of rituals that could seem strange to modern observers. In some traditions, the couple would break a piece of bread together or drink from the same cup to symbolize their shared future. In other places, the groom would present the bride with a symbolic gift, like a belt or a glove, which she would wear until the wedding day. Among the lower classes, betrothals were still serious commitments, though they were sometimes arranged less formally. A handshake, witnessed by family or neighbors, could seal the promise. In some villages, the couple would jump over a broom together or break a piece of bread as a sign of their commitment. Despite the formalities, the betrothal period was often filled with uncertainty. Many things could go wrong. Families could fall out of favor, political alliances could shift, diseases, accidents, or war could claim a future spouse before the wedding day. Yet the promise remained. A broken betrothal, particularly one that had lasted years, could stain a family's honor and damage their standing in the community. There were, however, some avenues to dissolve a betrothal. The medieval church, though deeply protective of marriage, recognized certain impediments. If it was discovered that the couple were closely related, a real risk in a world where noble families frequently intermarried, the betrothal could be annulled. Also, if one of the parties had previously been betrothed to someone else, the first betrothal took precedence, rendering the second invalid. Betrothals were not always free from scandal. Sometimes secret betrothals occurred, made without the knowledge or approval of the families. These clandestine promises could lead to bitter disputes, especially if the union was later challenged. The church, seeking to prevent such secret arrangements, emphasized the importance of public declarations and witnesses. The betrothal period also served as a time for families to negotiate the details of the marriage, including the dowry and the dower, the provision set aside for the bride in case her husband died. These negotiations were meticulous and could take months or even years to finalize. Families often employed legal scribes to draft detailed contracts outlining the terms. In some cases, the betrothal was followed by a formal hand-fasting ceremony. Hand-fasting was a public ritual in which the couple's hands were tied together with cords or cloth, symbolizing their bond. This tradition was especially popular in parts of Scotland and Northern Europe. While hand-fasting could signify betrothal or marriage, it often represented a trial period during which the couple might live together and determine their compatibility. Church, however, sought to eliminate the ambiguity of hand-fasting and other informal unions, pushing for standardized, church-sanctioned weddings with proper witnesses and priestly oversight. Over time, hand-fasting ceremonies declined in favor of formal weddings, but they never entirely disappeared, lingering as folk traditions in some rural areas. Throughout the betrothal period, the couple's behavior was carefully watched. They were expected to remain chaste, as premarital relations were frowned upon and could jeopardize the legitimacy of future heirs. However, evidence suggests that this rule was not always strictly followed, especially among couples who had been promised to each other since childhood and had grown to form personal bonds in noble circles. The betrothal period often involved the exchange of elaborate gifts. A groom might present his future bride with precious jewelry, fine fabrics, or even castles. The bride's family would prepare a dowry, sometimes transporting it in grand processions through the streets, publicly displaying their wealth and generosity. Betrothal feasts were another key element of the ritual. These celebrations, though typically smaller than the wedding feast, marked the beginning of the couple's public journey toward marriage. Songs would be sung, and the couple might sit together for the first time at the same table, observed by eager family members and curious villagers. Despite the formalities, the human element was always present. Young couples, particularly those who grew up together or formed friendships during their betrothal, sometimes found genuine affection. While love was rarely the purpose of the betrothal, it occasionally blossomed along the way, providing a hopeful contrast to the otherwise transactional nature of medieval unions. At times, the betrothal process could take unexpected turns. If a future spouse passed away before the wedding, the surviving betrothed was sometimes expected to marry a sibling of the deceased to maintain the family alliance. This practice, though not universal, illustrates the emphasis placed on familial ties over personal preference. In more dramatic cases, broken betrothals led to public feuds. Jilted families might seek legal remedies or even take matters into their own hands, pursuing revenge through political maneuvering or, in extreme cases, violence. These conflicts could ripple through communities, especially when powerful noble houses were involved. The church played an active role in arbitrating such disputes, often siding with the party that could best prove the validity of their claim. Legal battles over betrothals were not uncommon, with surviving records detailing arguments over promises made, witnesses present, and gifts exchanged. Ultimately, the strange and intricate betrothal rituals of medieval times were more than just customs. They were foundational to the fabric of society. They dictated the future of families, shaped political landscapes, and determined the course of countless individual lives. The wedding ceremony. The wedding ceremony in medieval times was a pivotal event, not just for the bride and groom, but for entire families, villages, and sometimes even kingdoms. It was a moment of public declaration, a binding ritual that sealed alliances, transferred wealth, and set the stage for the continuation of family lines. Yet, despite the heavy social, economic, and political implications, medieval weddings were often modest affairs, surprisingly different from the grand celebrations we associate with marriage today. The medieval church played a central role in shaping the structure and meaning of the wedding ceremony. By the 12th century, the church had firmly established marriage as a sacrament, a holy, indissoluble union blessed by God. This theological foundation elevated the importance of public ceremonies and clear consent from both parties. Yet, even as the church imposed structure, local customs and regional variations persisted, creating a rich tapestry of wedding practices. Typically, a medieval wedding was conducted outside the church, on the church steps rather than inside the building. The church reserved its sacred interior for the Mass, and the wedding, though sacred, was a social contract that needed to be witnessed by the community. Performing the ceremony outside allowed villagers and extended family to bear witness to the vows, ensuring the union's legitimacy. The essential elements of the wedding were surprisingly simple: mutual consent and the public exchange of vows. The priest would ask each party if they freely consented to the marriage. This moment was crucial. Despite the oft-arranged nature of medieval marriages, the church required verbal consent from both the bride and groom, though the definition of free consent was complicated by family pressures and societal expectations. Once consent was established, the couple would typically exchange rings. Unlike today's tradition of gold bands worn on the fourth finger of the left hand, rings in medieval times varied widely in material and symbolism. Some were made of braided grass, iron, or silver, and the choice often reflected the wealth and status of the families involved. The priest would then bless the couple, often using holy water, and lead them into the church to hear Mass together. This part of the ceremony symbolized the spiritual union and God's presence in their marriage. However, it is important to note that the church considered the marriage valid at the moment of consent and vow exchange. The Mass, while spiritually significant, was not strictly required for the marriage to be binding. Medieval wedding attire also reflected social class and local tradition. The bride did not typically wear white. This custom would not emerge until centuries later. Instead, she wore her finest dress, often in rich colors like red, blue, or green. Gold embroidery, fur trims, and elaborate headdresses adorned noble brides, while common women might simply wear their best wool or linen garments. Hair, a symbol of youth and purity, was often worn loose by young brides and braided or covered by older ones. The groom would also dress in his best attire, though practicality often dictated his choice of clothing. Nobles might wear velvet or silk tunics, adorned with family crests or symbolic embroidery. Peasant grooms typically wore their finest but most functional garments, suitable for the work that would soon follow the wedding festivities. One of the more curious aspects of medieval weddings was the role of the wedding party. Unlike modern bridesmaids and groomsmen, who were often close friends, medieval wedding attendants served practical purposes. They acted as witnesses, protected the couple from evil spirits, a deeply held medieval belief, and helped ensure the ceremony was conducted properly. The role of the dowry was prominent throughout the wedding ceremony. The bride's family often presented the dowry goods, money, or land as part of the proceedings, and this could be publicly displayed or ceremonially handed over to the groom's family. In noble marriages, dowries could be enormous, with entire towns, castles, or trade routes included in the negotiations. This exchange symbolized not only the joining of two individuals, but also the merging of family wealth and influence. Music, although modest compared to modern weddings, was a cherished part of the ceremony and ensuing celebrations. Minstrels, harpists, or flutists might accompany the wedding procession or play softly during the feast. In rural areas, local musicians provided simple but lively tunes, often using instruments like the bagpipe, rebec, or hurdy-gurdy. A particularly striking custom in some regions involved the public bedding ceremony. Friends and family would accompany the newlyweds to their bridal chamber, sometimes with music and teasing songs. It was not uncommon for close relatives or attendants to remain in the room until the couple was settled in bed. This ritual symbolized the community's acknowledgement and approval of the union, and was believed to safeguard the marriage's legitimacy. The bedding ceremony, though jarring by modern standards, was not intended as an invasion of privacy, but rather as a communal rite, ensuring that the marriage was properly consummated. In noble circles, witnesses to the bedding could be required. To testify later if the legitimacy of heirs was ever questioned, feasting was another essential part of the medieval wedding ceremony, often extending for several hours or even days. The size and extravagance of the feast depended on the wealth of the families involved. Nobles might host grand banquets with multiple courses, including roasted swans, venison, pies, and elaborate pastries shaped like castles or animals. Peasant weddings were more modest but equally joyous, featuring local breads, stews, and perhaps a special ale brewed for the occasion. The seating arrangement at the feast carried great social importance. The bride and groom typically sat at a raised table, flanked by family and honored guests. Lower status attendees would sit at distant tables or even stand. Toasts, songs, and sometimes theatrical performances would entertain the guests, while symbolic foods like spice cakes or sweetmeats were served to the couple. In some areas, the custom of the bride ale prevailed. This was a special brew prepared for the wedding, sometimes sold at the feast to raise money for the new couple. Drinking from the bride ale cup was believed to bring good fortune and fertility. Gift giving was another prominent feature of medieval wedding ceremonies. Guests might present the couple with practical items for their household: blankets, tools, livestock, or coins. In noble circles, gifts were often more elaborate, including jewelry, tapestries, or even land grants. These gifts were not only gestures of goodwill, but also expressions of social obligation and familial duty. The conclusion of the wedding ceremony did not signal the end of festivities. In fact, it marked the beginning of a lengthy celebration. In some regions, newlyweds were paraded through the village streets, accompanied by musicians and cheering neighbors. This public display was both a joyful celebration and a statement of the community's approval. Interestingly, many medieval wedding customs were designed to ward off bad luck and evil spirits. The use of loud music, the smashing of pottery, or the throwing of wheat, a precursor to modern rice-throwing traditions, were believed to protect the couple from harm and ensure fertility. Even the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold originated from the belief that evil spirits lurked at doorways, and lifting the bride would prevent them from clinging to her. Church law and local superstition often intertwined, producing unique blends of sacred and secular practices. While priests emphasized the holy sacrament of marriage, villagers clung to their folk traditions, believing that neglecting these rituals could bring misfortune. Despite the formalities, medieval weddings were not always solemn affairs. They were lively, filled with music, dancing, and sometimes mischievous pranks. It was not uncommon for the groom's friends to play harmless tricks, such as hiding the bride's shoes or staging playful games during the feast. These lighthearted customs added joy to what was often a serious social obligation, the wedding. Ceremony also served as a public reset of sorts. Debts might be forgiven, minor disputes settled, and community bonds strengthened during the gathering. Weddings were among the few occasions when lords, vassals, serfs, and townspeople might temporarily set aside their roles and celebrate together. At least in part. In towns and cities, processions to and from the church became grand spectacles, especially when wealthy or noble families were involved. Streets would be decorated, banners raised, and musicians hired to accompany the couple. These events provided rare public entertainment and opportunities for social interaction beyond the usual market days and church services. The church's increasing regulation of marriage ceremonies throughout the medieval period gradually standardized many practices. By the late Middle Ages, bans public announcements of the intended marriage were required to be read aloud in church on 3 consecutive Sundays. This allowed anyone with legal objections to come forward and reinforce the church's desire to prevent secret or inappropriate unions. Ultimately, the medieval wedding ceremony was a blend of public duty, sacred ritual, and human joy. It marked a critical turning point in life, especially for women, who often moved to their husband's home, adopted new responsibilities, and were expected to quickly bear children. Yet, within this structure, the medieval wedding was also a rare moment of festivity, a pause in the relentless grind of daily survival. It brought together communities, created new family ties, and offered a brief window of celebration in a world often dominated by hardship and rigid expectations. Through these ceremonies, we catch a glimpse of medieval society's complexities, its reverence for tradition, its blending of church and folklore, and its quiet acknowledgement that, amid all the obligations, there was still room for music, laughter, and perhaps love. The feast and celebrations of the wedding ceremony in medieval times was the solemn binding of a social and spiritual contract. The feast and celebrations that followed were the vibrant, joyous explosion of community life. The wedding feast was often the most anticipated part of the entire event, a time when families, friends, and entire villages gathered to celebrate, eat, drink, dance, and share in the happiness of the newly united couple. These celebrations could last for hours, days, or even weeks, depending on the wealth and status of the families involved. Feasting was more than just eating. It was a public statement of prosperity, generosity, and social standing. For noble families, a grand feast was an opportunity to display their wealth and power. The size of the feast, the variety of dishes, and the number of guests were all carefully noted by those in attendance. A meager feast could tarnish a family's reputation, while an extravagant one could elevate it. Preparation for a medieval wedding feast could begin weeks in advance. Cooks, servants, and even entire villages worked together to ensure the feast would be bountiful. Livestock were slaughtered, bread baked in massive ovens, barrels of ale brewed, and wine imported if the family could afford it. In some cases, special foods like swans, peacocks, or exotic spices were sourced from distant markets to impress the guests. The location of the feast varied. For noble weddings, it was typically held in the great hall of the family castle or manor. These halls were grand, with high wooden beams, stone walls adorned with tapestries, and long wooden tables. For common folk, the celebration might take place in a village square, a barn, or simply in the open air, where makeshift tables and benches were assembled to accommodate the crowd. The seating arrangement at the feast was a carefully orchestrated social map. The bride and groom sat at the high table, usually on a raised platform, signifying their honored status. Family members and distinguished guests sat closest to the couple, while distant relatives, friends, and villagers filled the tables further away. Seating order was not just a matter of convenience, but a visible ranking of social hierarchy. The feast began with a procession, often accompanied by musicians playing lutes, pipes, or drums. The newlyweds were led to their seats amid cheers and songs, their arrival a moment of communal celebration. It was customary for the guests to rise and toast the couple as they entered, sometimes throwing flower petals, herbs, or even small coins as symbols of fertility and prosperity. The menu for medieval wedding feasts was both lavish and symbolic. A typical noble feast might include roasted meats like beef, pork, venison, and game birds. Fish dishes were common, especially in regions near rivers or the sea. Pies filled with spiced meats, eggs, and vegetables added variety to the table. For the wealthy, the presentation was as important as the taste. Whole roasted animals might be decorated with gold leaf, and pies might be baked with live birds inside that would fly out when the crust was cut, providing a dramatic surprise. Common weddings featured simpler fare, stews, roasted chickens, fresh bread, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. Honey cakes, nuts, and fruits were typical desserts, and ale or mead flowed freely. Wine was rare among peasants, but might make a special appearance if provided by a generous lord. The wedding cake, as we know it today, did not exist in medieval times. Instead, a bride pie or bride cake might be served. This was often a spiced, dense bread or cake, sometimes stacked into tall layers. In some traditions, guests would attempt to kiss the bride by leaning over the stack without knocking it down, a precursor to modern cake-cutting ceremonies. Entertainment was essential to the celebration. Minstrels, jesters, acrobats, and dancers were frequently hired to perform. Stories and songs, often celebrating love, bravery, and local legends, would fill the hall. In noble feasts, elaborate performances, including short plays or mock tournaments, were staged to amuse the guests. Dancing was a central feature of the festivities. Traditional circle dances, line dances, and partner dances brought together people of all ages. The bride and groom typically led the first dance, surrounded by friends and family clapping and singing along. For many guests, dancing was one of the few times when social barriers briefly softened, allowing nobles and commoners to share in the joy. The drinking at medieval wedding feasts was legendary. Ale, mead, and wine flowed throughout the day and night, and toasts were frequent. Each toast was an opportunity to honor the couple, wish them fertility, and celebrate the joining of families. The term honeymoon is believed to have originated from the tradition of giving the newlyweds a month's supply of mead, thought to encourage conception and sweeten their early days of marriage. Games and playful rituals also featured prominently in the celebrations. In some regions, friends of the groom would stage mock battles or kidnap the bride as part of the entertainment, only to have the groom heroically retrieve her. These staged dramas were lighthearted and symbolized the groom's commitment and bravery. Among peasants, wedding celebrations were sometimes community-wide events, especially if the couple belonged to respected families. Villagers would contribute food, drink, or labor to help create the feast, and in return, everyone would join in the festivities. It was a time to set aside daily struggles and enjoy communal bonding. Pranks and humorous interruptions were common. Guests might hide the bride's shoes, requiring the groom to ransom them with a toast or a promise. In some places, young men would bar the couple's path to their new home, demanding payment in ale or coins before allowing them to pass. One of the most important symbols of the feast was the sharing of bread and drink. The couple would often break bread together or drink from the same cup, symbolizing unity and shared life. In some traditions, guests would take a sip from the same cup to signify communal support for the marriage. As the evening wore on, the feast transitioned from structured to free-flowing. Formalities gave way to spontaneous dancing, singing, and laughter. The firelight flickered across the faces of guests as stories were exchanged, and the barriers of rank and duty temporarily dissolved. The bedding ceremony, which sometimes followed the feast, was an extension of the communal nature of medieval weddings. Friends and family would accompany the couple to their chamber, singing bawdy songs and offering humorous advice. Though modern sensibilities might find this practice invasive, in medieval times, it served to publicly mark the consummation of the marriage, which was necessary for the union to be fully recognized. In noble households, the bedding ceremony could be a highly ritualized event. The bed might be blessed by a priest, and symbolic gestures like sprinkling the sheets with herbs were performed to ensure fertility. Witnesses might remain just long enough to see the couple under the covers before departing with good-natured laughter and more toasts. Following the feast and the bedding ceremony, the celebrations often continued the next day with more food, dancing, and sometimes even sporting events or hunts. In villages, these extended celebrations provided rare opportunities for relaxation and joy amidst the hardships of medieval life. Music played a constant role throughout the celebrations. Songs varied from region to region, but often included blessings for the couple, humorous ballads, and traditional dance tunes. Some songs carried superstitious significance, believed to bring good luck or protect against misfortune. Another curious tradition in some parts of Europe was the chivalry, a noisy mock serenade performed outside the couple's home. While sometimes associated with disapproval, the chivalry at weddings was more often a playful, raucous celebration with pots, pans, and makeshift instruments used to create a joyful cacophony. The wedding feast also provided a platform for the exchange of gifts. Guests presented the couple with practical items for their new household, such as tools, livestock, linens, or money. Among the nobility, gifts were more luxurious jewelry, fine fabrics, or even lands. These exchanges reinforced social ties and often carried obligations for future reciprocity. Even as the feast celebrated the couple, it also served as a reaffirmation of the social order. The structure of seating, the prominence of the dowry, and the roles played by family and community all reflected the deeply hierarchical nature of medieval society. Yet for a brief time, the laughter, music, and shared bread created a sense of unity that transcended class. In towns and cities, wedding celebrations could spill into public spaces. Streets were decorated, and processions of musicians and revelers moved through the town. These public displays allowed even those not invited to the formal feast to participate in the joy. Weddings also offered an opportunity to resolve disputes. It was not uncommon for minor quarrels to be settled during the festivities, often at the urging of mutual friends or family members who saw the occasion as a chance to restore harmony. In some regions, the morning after the feast included a second, smaller meal where close family members would gather to reflect on the events, share stories, and make further toasts to the couple's future. This more intimate gathering provided a gentle close to the exuberance of the main celebration. Ultimately, the medieval wedding feast was more than just a party. It was a deeply symbolic event that bound not just two people, but families, villages, and sometimes entire regions together. It was a celebration of life's continuance, a rare moment of collective joy, and a profound acknowledgement of the couple's place within their community. Even centuries later, echoes of these medieval traditions remain in modern weddings. The toasts, the shared cake, the communal dancing, and the symbolic gestures of unity. They remind us that beneath the layers of history and cultural change, the desire to celebrate love, partnership, and community has always been, and likely always will be, a cherished part of the human experience. Odd wedding customs, while medieval weddings were structured around familiar rituals of union, consent, and celebration, they also gave rise to a wide range of odd, curious, and sometimes downright bizarre customs that varied from region to region. These traditions, born from a mixture of superstition, local folklore, religious belief, and social norms, often reveal the lighter, quirkier, and sometimes darker sides of medieval society. They were seen as essential to ensuring a successful marriage, protecting the couple from misfortune, and solidifying communal bonds. To the modern observer, many of these customs seem strange, but in the medieval world, they were deeply meaningful. One of the most peculiar wedding customs was the ritual of the bride's kidnapping. In some regions, particularly among the Germanic tribes and parts of Eastern Europe, it was customary for the groom's friends to abduct the bride either before or during the wedding celebrations. Sometimes this was a playful act arranged in advance, meant to test the groom's resolve and determination. In other cases, the kidnapping was staged as part of a mock battle, with the groom and his friends rescuing the bride after overcoming a series of humorous challenges or games. This practice is believed to have roots in ancient marriage by capture traditions, where abducting women from rival tribes served as a means of forming alliances or expanding territories. By the medieval period, the ritual had become more symbolic, but still emphasized the idea of the groom proving his worth, and the bride's symbolic transition from her family's protection to her husband's. Another curious custom involved the breaking of dishes and pottery. In some regions, guests would deliberately smash plates, pots, or other ceramics during the wedding feast. This noisy ritual was believed to scare away evil spirits and bring good luck to the newlyweds. The couple was sometimes expected to clean up the shards together, symbolizing their future cooperation in overcoming life's obstacles. The use of loud noises to ward off evil was a recurring theme in medieval weddings. Bells were rung, drums were beaten, and, in some cases, guests would bang pots and pans as the newlyweds processed through the village streets. This tradition likely evolved into the modern custom of honking car horns during wedding processions. Particularly odd custom was the throwing of shoes. In some areas, it was traditional for guests to throw old shoes at the departing bride and groom as they left the wedding venue. Unlike the modern practice of throwing rice or confetti, shoes were thought to confer fertility and prosperity. The groom was sometimes expected to catch a shoe and present it to his bride as a playful gesture of possession and good fortune. Footwear, in general, played an interesting role in medieval wedding customs. In some English villages, it was believed that whoever touched the bride's shoe would be the next to marry. In other places, the groom would symbolically tap the bride's heel with his shoe to signify his new authority in the marriage. Another widespread tradition involved the gifting of odd items as wedding presents. While many gifts were practical linens, tools, livestock, others were intentionally humorous or symbolic. Guests might present the couple with a wooden spoon to ward off hunger, or a broom to ensure a clean and harmonious household. In some areas, friends would sneak symbolic nuisance gifts, like a bucket with a hole or a broken spindle, into the couple's pile of wedding presents, offering light-hearted reminders of the trials of domestic life. The superstition surrounding wedding days was also notable. Medieval people believed that certain days of the week, or even specific times of the day, were more auspicious for marriage. Wednesday was widely considered the luckiest day for weddings, while Friday was associated with bad fortune. Marrying during a waxing moon was believed to bring growth and prosperity, while a waning moon signaled decline. One of the more bizarre customs was the so-called chivalry, which could take on a more disruptive tone. Friends, neighbors, and sometimes disapproving relatives would gather outside the couple's home on their wedding night and create a cacophony of sound with drums, horns, and pots. In its more mischievous forms, the chivalry was used to express community disapproval, particularly in cases of mismatched marriages or unions seen as inappropriate due to age or status differences. In its lighter form, however, the chivalry was simply a noisy, playful way to mark the couple's transition to married life. Another odd practice involved the bedding of the bride and groom. Beyond the public bedding ceremony, some regions held traditions where the couple's bed was ritually prepared by the wedding guests, who would sprinkle it with grains, flowers, and sometimes even symbolic objects like acorns for fertility, or iron nails for protection. Friends would sometimes hide coins or small gifts under the mattress as tokens of good luck, and more rural traditions. It was customary to blockade the newlyweds on their way to their home. Villagers would erect symbolic barriers or rope across the road, requiring the groom to offer coins, ale, or other gifts to pass through. This playful toll was seen as a final challenge, testing the groom's generosity and humor. In some areas, the bride's hair held special significance. Loose hair symbolized virginity and purity, and during the wedding, the bride's hair might be ceremonially braided or covered by a veil to signify her transition to married life. Among some noble families, cutting a small lock of the bride's hair was considered a protective ritual, with the hair often kept in a locket or woven into a charm. Food and drink were also rich sources of unusual customs. The bride ale was a special brew made specifically for the wedding feast. Guests were expected to purchase mugs of this ale, and the proceeds often helped. After the wedding, the festivities may have ended, the vows exchanged, and the guests departed. But for medieval couples, life after the wedding marked the true beginning of their journey together. The transition from celebration to daily life was swift, and the responsibilities that awaited both bride and groom were often immense, shaped by social expectations, economic demands, and deeply entrenched gender roles. What came after the wedding was a lifetime of partnership, but one that unfolded under the weight of tradition, duty, and, for many, survival. The first and most immediate expectation following the wedding was the consummation of the marriage. This was not merely a personal milestone, but a legal and social requirement. In medieval society, a marriage was not considered fully valid or binding until it had been physically consummated. This belief was so central that, in cases of annulment, the ability or inability to consummate the marriage was often the deciding factor. In noble and royal circles, the consummation was sometimes witnessed indirectly. Attendants might escort the newlyweds to their chamber, offer final blessings, and remain nearby as a form of ceremonial confirmation. The bedding ceremony, as discussed earlier, was both a public acknowledgement and a social safeguard to ensure that no objections to the legitimacy of heirs could be raised later. For noble couples, life after the wedding often meant managing estates, securing political alliances, and, most importantly, producing heirs. The pressure to bear children, particularly male heirs, was immense. A wife's primary duty was to provide sons who could inherit titles, land, and family wealth. In many cases, the health of the marriage was publicly measured by the speed and frequency of childbirth. Childbearing, however, was fraught with danger. Medieval medicine was rudimentary, and the risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth were high. Women were often married in their early to mid-teens, and their youth was seen as beneficial for fertility, though it also made the risks of complications greater. The church, family, and community all reinforced the expectation that a woman's primary role was to bear and raise children. For the common folk, life after the wedding focused on building a household and contributing to the local economy. Newlyweds might establish a home of their own, or more often, move in with extended family, particularly if resources were scarce. Marriage signified the beginning of adult responsibilities, tending to crops, raising livestock, weaving, brewing, and managing daily survival. Work was usually divided along traditional gender lines. Men typically handled heavy labor, fieldwork, and trade, while women managed the household, cared for children, and produced essential goods like bread, cloth, and ale. Yet, in many cases, women worked alongside their husbands in the fields or participated in family businesses. The idea of strict separation of duties was less rigid among peasants, where survival often depended on the contributions of both partners. Among merchants and artisans, marriage was as much a business arrangement as a personal one. Wives frequently helped run shops, manage accounts, and maintain customer relationships. In urban centers, some women even inherited and operated businesses in the event of their husband's death, demonstrating that marriage could offer economic opportunities as well as social status. Social life for married couples varied by class and location. Village life was communal, and married couples participated in local festivals, religious observances, and guild activities. For the nobility, marriage often meant entertaining guests, hosting feasts, and attending court. In both settings, the couple's success and reputation were tied to their ability to maintain harmony within their household and contribute positively to the community. While the church preached the virtues of fidelity and mutual respect, reality of medieval marriage was often more complicated. Marriages of convenience, arranged unions, and political alliances meant that emotional intimacy was not always the foundation of a marital relationship. Infidelity did occur, though its consequences were heavily gendered. Wives who strayed faced severe social and legal penalties, while husbands, particularly among the nobility, were often given more leeway. Love in medieval marriage was not absent, but it was rarely the primary consideration at the time of the wedding. Over time, however, many couples grew close, sharing the burdens and joys of life, raising children together, and building genuine companionship. Courtly love, a concept celebrated in medieval literature, often existed outside of marriage, but it also influenced how affection and partnership were eventually viewed within the marital bond in noble marriages. The birth of children marked important milestones, and each child's baptism was a community event. Godparents, chosen carefully for their social connections or religious standing, played significant roles in the child's upbringing. The survival of children was far from guaranteed. Infant mortality rates were high, and the grief of losing a child was a common, though deeply painful, part of medieval family life. After the wedding, the role of the wife extended beyond motherhood. She was expected to manage the household, instruct servants, oversee food production, and in noble households, manage the estate in her husband's absence. Some noble women acted as regents, ruling territories when their husbands were away at war or in the king's service. These women wielded real power, though always within the constraints of a patriarchal society. For husbands, life after the wedding often involved increased responsibility, whether it was managing land, participating in local governance, or providing for the growing family. Among the peasantry, this meant hard labor and navigating the cycles of harvest and famine. For knights and nobles, it meant military service, managing vassals, and securing political alliances. DOWRAEs, which were negotiated before the wedding, continued to influence postmarital life. A wife's dowry was often used to support the household, invest in land, or fund business ventures. In the unfortunate event of a husband's death, a widow's rights to her dowry and any associated property became critical to her survival and her ability to care for her children. Widowhood was both a peril and, sometimes, a form of newfound independence. Widows, particularly those of means, could inherit property, run businesses, and in some cases, choose whether or not to remarry. Some women embraced widowhood as a chance to closing thoughts the world of medieval weddings with its intricate rituals, symbolic gestures, and sometimes peculiar customs offers a fascinating glimpse into the social fabric of a bygone era. From the practical arrangements of betrothals to the grandeur of wedding feasts, from the odd traditions that made each ceremony unique to the deeply personal journey that began after the celebrations. Medieval marriage was a tapestry woven with threads of duty, faith, love, and community. Marriage, in medieval times, was not a simple union between two individuals. It was a binding contract that carried significant weight for families, villages, and kingdoms. It served as the foundation for economic stability, social structure, and political alliances. Yet, despite these grand functions, it was also profoundly human, a partnership filled with joys, struggles, affection, and occasionally deep love. While some of the customs and beliefs may seem strange to modern eyes, they reveal a society deeply concerned with securing happiness, prosperity, and fertility for the couple. The laughter of the wedding feast, the noise of the chivalry, the playful pranks, and the heartfelt toasts all reflect a timeless desire to celebrate life's most meaningful transitions in the company of loved ones. The medieval wedding was a bridge between the sacred and the social, the personal and the public. It was a rite of passage that shaped not only the couple's future, but also the destiny of families and communities. And while the trappings of marriage have changed over the centuries, the core values, companionship, family, hope for the future remain. Enduring an universal dot in revisiting the weddings of the medieval world, we are reminded that beneath the layers of history and tradition, the essence of marriage has always been about two people finding their place together in the ever-turning story of life.